Few fantasy stories have gripped audiences as much in the last 10 years as Patrick Rothfuss's Kingkiller Chronicle. The first 2 books of the planned trilogy have sold over 10 million copies, and the series is set to be adapted into a film by Sam Raimi and Lin-Manuel Miranda. I think there are a lot of factors that have played into the Kingkiller Chronicle's success. Rothfuss's writing style, his flair for memorable characters, and obviously the intriguing plot. But I also think the Kingkiller Chronicle stands out in the fantasy genre because of the way Rothfuss flips genre tropes on their head and shows us a side of a fantasy hero that we've never seen before. The writer John G. Kowalty wrote several influential essays about genre fiction and how it evolves. He focused mostly on westerns, but I think his theories apply equally well to fantasy. Basically, Kowalty's theory is that popular genres have a life cycle. They emerge, they become popular, audiences get bored of them, and then the genre is forced to either die or transform in order to keep the audience interested. In Kowalty's view, these genre transformations can take one of 4 forms. Burlesque, which is basically when a genre pokes fun at itself. Nostalgia, which involves conjuring up a sense of a past time. And then thirdly, there's demythologization, and finally, reaffirmation of myth. I think The Name of the Wind makes use of all these genre transformations to some degree. The book deals heavily in nostalgia, employing a range of fantasy tropes, but Rothfuss finds a way to give them a twist. There are dragons, but they're wild lizards. There's a wizard school, but it's full of vicious politics and deadly magic. There's a hero, but he messes up a lot. Rothfuss himself admits that finding this balance between the old and the new was one of the hardest parts of writing the series. He says, "I wanted this story to be something a little new and a little different, but at the same time I wanted it to be familiar and warm and exciting in nostalgic ways." Even the series' plot, that of an orphan growing up, discovering his magical powers, and taking on a dark villain, it's classic fantasy, stretching back from Harry Potter to Lord of the Rings and Beowulf. But The Name of the Wind pokes holes in this narrative. Quoth isn't a stereotypical hero, and his life doesn't exactly follow Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. After all, Quoth's story might be wonderful and epic, but it ends with him working as a depressed barkeeper in the middle of nowhere. Likewise, while Quoth's first encounter with the Chandrian feels like a reference to Frodo's first close call with the Ringwraiths, Rothfuss's version reads like an entry from a soldier's diary. He doesn't focus on the magic, instead he emphasizes the shock and the destruction, and even implies that the young Quoth suffers from a kind of PTSD. In other words, much like Game of Thrones, The Name of the Wind is at least to some degree a reaction to the state of the fantasy genre. Just as George R.R. Martin does, Rothfuss shows us a fantasy world with realistic violence and real brutality. The Name of the Wind and A Song of Ice and Fire both demythologize the classic fantasy story itself. Quoth himself expressed this idea literally when he says, "It is very fair to wonder how much of this is real, how much of this is true. Unfortunately, any answer that I gave to you would be destructive to the story. If I were going to go back and mythologize my life, I would leave out so many of the terrible choices that I made." But here's where I think The Name of the Wind differs from Game of Thrones. Whereas George R.R. Martin just exposes the classic fantasy narrative as a fake, Rothfuss still seems to find value in it. He admits that the hero's journey isn't true, but nevertheless reaffirms the power of the story itself. This is the 4th type of genre transformation, the reaffirmation of myth. Kowalty describes this as when a traditional genre and its myth are probed and shown to be unreal, but then the myth itself is at least partially affirmed as a reflection of authentic human aspirations and needs. An example of this is when Quoth repeatedly admits that the narrative of him as a hero is too simplistic, and yet he clings to it and even adds to it. For example, he admits to Bast that the truth is, "I wasn't living in a story," but later he says, "The best lies about me are the ones I told." So Quoth and Rothfuss are both playing into the reader's expectations of what a fantasy story should be, but then undermining it, only to remind us that the stories do actually have power, especially if you believe in them, just like Quoth spreads rumors about himself to build up his own reputation. That's also the motivation behind Bast trying to get Quoth to remember that he used to be a hero. It doesn't need to be true, Quoth just needs to believe it. We see this again when Scarpy jokes with Quoth, saying all stories are true. but this one really happened, if that's what you mean. I think that's part of what makes The Name of the Wind so unique. It's that it's a fantasy about fantasy making, a story about storytelling. It's like everyone tells a story about themselves inside their own head, quote says in the first book. Always, all the time. That story makes you what you are. We build ourselves out of that story. Rothfuss builds a whole world out of that story, and in the process reinvigorates an entire genre. Thanks for watching.